The nuclear threat continues to be there. In some ways, at the end of the Cold War, a lot of the public was like, ooh, glad that's done. And they focused elsewhere, but the threat never went away. It's actually become more complex. And we need the public involved in the conversation, pressing their leaders.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. In just the first 4 months of the Trump administration, several pillars of American foreign policy have been upended. USAID dismantled, most foreign aid frozen, and the rules-based international trade system thrown into disarray. So, could nuclear policy be next? To find out, I spoke with Alexandra Bell, president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and a former senior State Department official on nuclear issues. She breaks down the key decisions facing the administration and the risks tied to some of the options on the table, particularly around missile defense. We also unpack the state of nuclear diplomacy with Russia and China and why forcing trilateral arms control talks is likely a dead end. This conversation is a clear-eyed look at the current state of play of Trump's nuclear policy and where it may be headed next. We recorded our conversation live at the Carnegie International Nuclear Policy Conference. More episodes pegged to this conference are coming soon. To be alerted when they are published, please visit globaldispatches.org and sign up for the newsletter. Thanks. And now here is Alexandra Bell, President and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. So, Alex, I wanted to kick off by asking you what we know about Donald Trump's nuclear policies thus far. In the first 4 months of this administration, we've seen an upending of a lot of sort of conventional pillars of American foreign policy. We've seen the dissolution of USAID. We've seen the freezing of foreign aid. We've seen a kind of unprecedented attack on free trade. Has there been any sort of moves that are kind of aberrational in historical context on the nuclear policy front thus far?
On nuclear policy, we haven't really seen what the Trump administration wants to do yet. The nominee to be the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the State Department had his nomination hearing where he gave some indication that the administration was interested in, full force funding for nuclear modernization, an acknowledgement of the dangers of a growing Chinese nuclear arsenal. At the same time, a willingness to engage in diplomacy. And this is something that the president has talked about many times before. Going back to the 80s, he was interested in having President Reagan make him the ambassador to Russia so he could negotiate these types of agreements. He tends to reference his uncle, who was a professor at MIT, who had a background on these issues, seems to have influenced him, clearly believes that nuclear threats are existential, has made repeated comments about the need for denuclearization, how much money we're spending. At the same time, he's talking about things like Golden Dome.
What's Golden Dome? You'll have to explain that.
This idea, well, it doesn't really exist yet, I think, except for in his head, and it doesn't make tons of sense because if you were going to try to protect yourself with a metal, gold wouldn't be the one because it's very malleable. But I think
you don't want like vibranium, vibranium shield.
That's available.
Adamantium shield.
So Israel has a missile defense system that the U.S. actually helped provide called Iron Dome.
Yes.
But that's about defending against short and potentially even medium range missiles. And that's a technology that we've been able to have some success with. Now, long range missile defense has never worked the way that we envisioned it. Reagan also was looking at something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, sometimes disparagingly called Star Wars. And the science didn't come together. We backed off of that. But I think President Trump hasn't really realized investments in defensive capabilities actually have implications for offensive capabilities. So if we make a deal with the Russians on a further deal, hopefully with the Russians on strategic weapons, the Russians would perceive investments in defensive capabilities as offsetting that balance. So in some respects, we haven't really seen a full strategy come together. I think there are a lot of tactics we've seen so far. There's a lot of personal motivations he seems to have. Clearly wanted to make a deal with North Korea in his first term. That didn't work out. But so far, a strategy, we haven't seen one.
Can I ask, on this question of investing in defensive capabilities, it seems to me that, it's almost like a fairly conventional Republican administration point of view to want to invest more in these defensive capabilities. You referenced Reagan's Star Wars, then you had the Bush administration pull out of the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and now you have the Trump administration kind of playing footsie with this idea of a golden dome. So at least as you're framing it to me, this seems like kind of like almost normal in the context of Republican administrations. And I just raise that because a lot of the other things that Trump is doing in other aspects of foreign policy are aberrational. And so I just wanted to kind of put that to you.
So that's very much been a through line, the idea that we can some sort of get ourselves out of a situation of mutually assured destruction where we would have this extra layer of protection. But again, that upsets the balance of mutually assured destruction, which some people like to talk about as a policy choice. It's not a policy choice. It's a state of being. Unfortunately, we are in a situation where Russia presents an existential threat to us and vice versa. And we've been able to sort of stabilize our postures and our forces to feel relatively confident that neither side would make a move. Now, if you do things to upset that balance, like say, make heavy investments in missile defenses as a way to have an extra layer of protection, the other side is going to react, usually by building more offensive systems. In fact, the sort of exotic nuclear weapons that President Putin debuted during Trump's first term were all systems designed to get around possible missile defenses. To add to that, the withdrawal from the ABM treaty that you talked about during the George W. Bush administration resulted in a situation where we lost that treaty. And sort of that was the first sort of thread that started pulling apart stability between the US and Russia in the nuclear realm. But we've never actually gone past the level of interceptors, missile defense interceptors, we were actually allowed to have under the treaty. So we've lost the treaty. We haven't actually needed to withdraw from it. Those interceptors don't work. So we've invested lots of money. We've undermined this tenet that was very important to the Russians. And we're not really in a better place. In fact, in many ways, a worse place. So at this point, we've really got to get back to the fundamentals of what creates nuclear stability between us and Russia, who still have over 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world, and what can incentivize both sides from trying to not undermine each other's strategic deterrent and capabilities, but actually find a way to roll back these programs to keep stability between us. And that's really going to be what the Trump administration is going to have to think about. The last remaining strategic arms reduction treaty and the last real guardrails on the US-Russian deterrence will expire in February of 2026. No way to extend it.
This is the start.
The New START treaty. Yeah. There's no way to extend it. That is the end of the life of that treaty. They've got less than a year to build something new. They've got the teams to do it. The US has the teams to do it. A little bit hard to do when people that you might have on a negotiating team are worried about losing their job at any given moment. So if the administration is interested in pursuing a deal, in making a deal that's in the US security interest, it's in the global security interest, it's in the Russian security interest, they've got to get to work and they've got to stabilize these attacks on the civil service.
So the expiration of the New START treaty next year is one kind of key inflection point coming forward in terms of choices and decisions Trump will have to make on the nuclear policy front. Is there anything else that you're looking towards in the coming weeks or months that will suggest to you what kind of nuclear policy this administration will pursue?
Yes. So next week, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Preparatory Committee meeting.
PrepCom. Everyone loves the PrepCom.
PrepCom, and everyone, interstitial multilateral meetings.
Yeah.
Everybody loves them.
Just to back up here. So was it every 5 years there's the NPT review conference?
Review conference every 5 years.
Every 5 years, and then every couple of years.
The 4 years leading up to the review conference were on a bit of a shortened schedule because of COVID.
Yeah.
But they states parties to the NPT, which is really the glue that holds everything together in the nuclear world. States parties meet, discuss challenges to the treaty, things that states should be working on together. So that starts next week.
Yeah, and in a typical UN fashion, it's a meeting to prepare for a more important meeting.
Yes.
But it is very significant. I don't mean to diminish that. So the PrepCom is next week at the United Nations.
Yes, starts Monday. Yeah. And so the US will undoubtedly make an opening statement, frame how this administration is looking at the NPT. At least I hope. If they don't, that will create a certain amount of concern. There have been other opportunities thus far in international fora for the US to talk about this. Haven't actually done it yet, but as they're getting people on board, I would expect to see some things there. I would expect that there are going to be a lot of allies who are asking questions of the United States, trying to get a better idea of where the policies are going to go. Russia, as I said, is one challenge the United States will need to take on. The second is China. China is rapidly growing its nuclear arsenal in an opaque and dangerous manner. So that is a problem and a challenge that the world and the United States will need to take on and find a way to have a conversation with the Chinese. And that won't be the same conversation we have with Russia. Been at it with the Russians for 50 years. As you know, it's still really difficult. We've got to find a new way to talk to the Chinese and not just try to assume everything that worked with the Soviets and then the Russians will work for the Chinese. And then, of course, there are the non-proliferation issues that will come up next week at the UN, but over the course of the Trump administration, and that's Iran. Obviously, they're in the beginnings of negotiations now, also North Korea. And then the new problem that seems to have appeared, which is whether or not some US allies might actually think about pursuing indigenous nuclear capabilities, which would be an unprecedented challenge. We haven't had a new proliferation issue come up for some time.
And that's actually been a recurring theme in this conference, is the concern that the withdrawal of American kind of conventional security guarantees or to Europe and to NATO allies, not necessarily the withdrawal, just like the idea that maybe it's not as solid as one might have thought because of certain capricious actions taken by the administration might inspire America's traditional allies to pursue their own nuclear deterrent, which would be a proliferation risk.
Absolutely. And I think that's why we have to go back to why it was that the term of art is extended deterrence, why we were providing effectively a nuclear umbrella for our allies. And one of the reasons is we didn't want dozens of countries to get their own nuclear capabilities. That inherently, the more nuclear weapons programs in more hands, you're just increasing risk exponentially every time. So we found that the forward projection of American power was not only good for those allies, but good for the US. And Russia has been a critic, and so has China, of these relationships, despite the fact that they existed before the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty existed, while it was being negotiated, when it was indefinitely extended in 95. This was always a scenario that people understood and people accepted. And the critiques have been, increasing over the years. And now we're in a situation where I almost want to ask the Russians or tell the Russians and the Chinese, be careful what you wish for. The critiques on this relationship that the US had, it was easy for them to sort of cast stones in these international fora. But I don't think that Moscow or Beijing think it's in their interest to see mass proliferation, including immediately on their border.
Earlier you mentioned China's nuclear buildup, and there has been talk by some in the administration, at least in the previous term, about wanting to kind of scrap bilateral agreements between the US and Russia and try to make some sort of trilateral arrangement on arms control or non-proliferation or something on like some nuclear deal between Russia, China, and the United States. Do you see like wisdom or utility in pursuing that approach?
I think the problem there is, how are you going to make that deal? Because even with China expanded its forces, it still has a vastly different size force, a different, way of posturing it. Also, again, the US and the Russians have been at this for 50 years. We're quite comfortable letting each other into our strategic facilities, doing on-the-ground inspections, data exchanges. We have a lot of muscle memory and a lot of acknowledgement of what good comes out of these arrangements. I don't know that the Chinese are ready to let US inspectors into their strategic facilities, nor do I think we're ready to have Chinese inspectors at our bases. It takes time to work up to that. I think the issue is keep what we've got with Russia that works and build something with China that's fit for purpose. Also, when you bring up the idea of a trilateral agreement, it's not surprising that Russia and China bring up, well, okay, now Britain and France need to come in because they're on your side. And so they have to be a part of this too. That is exactly why we have a P5 conversation. So the P5 are the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states under the treaty: US, UK, Russia, France, China. So we've been having those slow, quiet meetings over time, talking about nuclear doctrine, talking about nuclear risk reduction. So if you're aiming multilateral, you should probably anticipate that you're going to have to do all 5. And then again, you get into how do you verify something like that? How do you do asymmetric arms control if we have different size forces? So I understand the reason of wanting to get China into something, but square peg round hole. You're just going to have to figure out a way to bring China in, which may in fact have to result in some conversations with the Chinese about conventional arms control, something that we've never really thought about, but probably should, because a lot of Chinese threat perception is built on US conventional capabilities.
So lastly, I know we both got to get back to a busy conference, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, as head of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, why the doomsday clock has moved closer than ever to midnight. Armageddon, 89 seconds, I believe.
89 seconds to midnight. So for those of you who don't know, the doomsday clock is meant to be a metaphor for the dangers that the human race is facing in terms of human-made existential risks. So at the beginning of the nuclear age, Einstein, Oppenheimer create the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists to make sure there's a forum, not an academic forum, but a forum for scientists to engage with the public about the new threats and challenges and potential benefits of the nuclear age. And then over time, the idea of the clock came about of just trying to conceptualize for people the danger that we find ourselves in. And over time, the Bulletin has expanded to have other existential, man-made existential risks included in how we view the clock. And so climate change, biosecurity, emerging and disruptive technologies like AI, all of which intersect with the nuclear threat. So that's how we find ourselves in a situation where we're the closest to midnight we've ever been because of the complex and growing threats in the existential risk space. But at the same time, we're always careful at the Bulletin to say this should be seen as a warning, but not as a reason for despair. We created these problems. We are fully capable of managing them, of mitigating their effects, of rolling back these risks. So that's what the clock tries to do. And I think with the 89 seconds, and we moved from 90 to 89, and to me, that was an indication that every second counts, that we really don't have time to lose, that we've got to find ways where we can talk about mitigating the effects of climate change, understanding we also have to keep economic considerations in the mix, that we have to find ways to build norms and behaviors around AI, quantum computing, other emerging tech as a way to manage that threat, understanding that AI, quantum, and other emerging tech can actually help us reduce nuclear risk, particularly when it comes to things like verification and monitoring, that the nuclear threat continues to be there. In some ways, at the end of the Cold War, a lot of the public was like, ooh, glad that's done, and they focused elsewhere, but the threat never went away. It's actually become more complex, and we need the public involved in the conversation, pressing their leaders to actually find ways to find common ground and save ourselves from ourselves.
Thank you so much for your time. This was great.
Yeah,
I really appreciate it.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.